We are obviously fresh into a new year. So you don't have to tell us what it was, but did you make a New Year's resolution?
Not yet, actually.
Did you
Never
make
too
one?
late.
Did you make one for 2020?
Uh, I did actually, and I'm not sure I really was very good at kind of landing it in the end. I think the break was such a good way to kind of disconnect from what was a super intense year that I think the to-do list for 2021 is still something I need to do on the resolution front. So
All right. Well, you could also recycle the ones that you didn't do from last year.
excellent, absolutely.
Okay. So when I was reading your bio, it came across that you really like to build things. I mean, you went from Colgate to L'Oreal to Google to now your role at GSK. So do you, and at GSK, you also talk about, the role of innovation and having an innovation pipeline. So do you think because you guys already had that mindset and that innovation happening within GSK, that it allowed you guys to kind of react quicker and pivot faster than some other brands last year?
Yeah, for sure. I think what's fascinating is to be in healthcare these days, right? So obviously, there's huge expectation in terms of how we can have in the current help in the current context. And one of the things that we've been very passionate about is to make sure that we're looking at how we can help across the consumer experience journey, right? So historically, we've been super focused on making sure we're delivering a product or solution when the consumer is sick or when they have a pain problem. I think what we're looking at now, and we had done that pre-COVID, is to really understand how we can be there when the consumer is still healthy, when the consumer starts to feel vulnerable, of course, when the consumer is sick, and also when the consumer starts to get into recovery mode. And what does that trigger from an innovation perspective? We started to think about that back in my L'Oreal days, where we thought, having amazing products remains critical. But wouldn't it be great to start to build competitive advantage by creating a service, something that surrounds the product, and that combination of those two things coming together creates kind of a secret sauce. And I think L'Oreal has done a lot of stuff while I was there and since I've left, and I feel like we can really do that at GSK and started to do that very effectively to really bring a next level of care to healthcare, which is exciting.
Okay. The other thing that I saw in your bio, and I saw when you were speaking in a couple different places, is this notion of digitalceuticals. So I know that we're in media, we're in advertising, there's a bunch of words and acronyms. Can you kind of define to us what that means?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to the point that I just made in regards to what is the innovation of the future, and is it going to be a potion or a pill, or is it going to be something that enhances the pill or something that potentially replaces the pill, right? So some of the things that I found fascinating is that in one of our categories, so we are one of the biggest player in the pain relief space, and so some of the things that we're starting to see is that virtual reality is used in certain instances to treat patients. For example, children that have gone through serious burns, and so you put them through an experience of a VR immersive session, and it turns out that it's actually helping the consumer to go through the changing of the bandages in a way that's much easier than if you take a pill. So for me, that's an example where the digiceutical, the virtual experience that you've been through is actually more effective than the pill itself. And I think in the future, we believe that, of course, having the pill or the potion will continue to be absolutely critical. And that's where we've been and that's where we've excelled in. But more and more, there'll be an expectation from consumer to have stuff that will surround it or potentially even, as in this particular example, replace it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you said, it's like different ways to help the consumer. So it's not just giving them medicine, it's actually like understanding their need and making it a little bit easier. The other question I had, so, in this amazing journey and career you had, your last job was Google and then you got to GSK. Can you tell us like a little bit of what excited you about the role at GSK and kind of how you got there?
Yeah, no, when I was at Google, I got a call from someone at GSK saying, I want to make sure I get more attention from Google, and I'm really we're very serious about where we want to take the organization from a digital transformation perspective, and so I actually started to create Team GSK while I was at Google, and so that gave me a good sense of what healthcare was all about, which was an industry or a sector or vertical that I wasn't as familiar with. And I started to realize how fascinating that space was. I always thought, beauty and digital were a perfect fit, and they certainly are. But I feel digital and healthcare are such a powerful kind of combination, and I think COVID has certainly kind of shown and illustrated that. So when I found out that there was a CDO position being created, I thought it was an amazing opportunity for me to go back on the advertiser side and take my experience and my learnings from the Google days and apply that to the role, which has been a fascinating journey over the last 4 years.
And then, so like a little bit more about, because you talk a lot about digital and health being the perfect marriage, like how they come together. So a little bit about that. And then your thoughts on, do you think that the pandemic happening and COVID happening accelerated the need to like bringing technology and health together?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I gave you the example of pain before, which for me just shows that, there's huge opportunity for us to kind of think about innovation in a different way. Some of the things that we're seeing is obviously a huge kind of emergence of telehealth or teledentistry, for example, which goes back to this notion about how do you connect with experts in a completely different way, right? And at the end of the day, a lot of our secret sauce is how we interact in our business with healthcare professionals. And I think digital and technology enables to create, at scale interactions that didn't necessarily were possible, I guess, in the past. So I think that's just another example, I think, in terms of how technology enables kind of a healthcare experience that's very different, because we know that the healthcare professional, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a dentist, are incredibly influential in terms of the choices that consumers make, particularly in a time of uncertainty when they're not sure what is the right solution for them. We saw huge percentages of consumers actually looking for information in the COVID days. We saw consumer kind of linking existing conditions with COVID, and asking lots of questions and putting that into Google search. We saw people kind of looking for dry mouth and COVID, or pain, back pain and COVID, or allergy and COVID. So that was one whole kind of area that we
personally Googled like every combination and COVID.
Correct.
Like,
so that was that was one kind of trend. And the other trend is we saw lots of people kind of looking at how they can boost immunity, whether it was zinc and COVID, or whether, it was how I, sanitize my toothbrushes and COVID. And so it was really interesting in terms of us understanding from an audience perspective, and what is needed from a content perspective. So are people in prevention mode, or are they in trying to are they in prevention mode, or are they in diagnostic mode, right? And so those were the distinction that we needed to make based on some of those search queries, and then kind of build the content that would help them answer some of those queries. So it really put the pressure on us on making sure we're there for them, we're helping them, we're guiding them, and work through a very uncertain kind of environment, and helping them in the process.
So organizationally with the Innovation Lab, you have to internally get people to think differently. And then being consumer centric with consumer behavior changing, you have to speak differently to consumers. So those are two massive kind of catatonic shifts for an organization. So, I know that, I saw you speaking in Mexico back in 2019, and you guys have been thinking about this, for a while, but how do you organizationally, do you have to bring different people into GSK to think differently? How do you start to encourage people to think differently, embrace technology, digitize the organization, when they've been doing things a certain way for a long period of time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think we created a group that we call the Next Team. And so the Next Team within GSK is tasked to develop the innovation that I described before, which is not your typical kind of innovation, right? So it's kind of what we call our disruptive new, and it's really about generating that pipeline of new opportunities and new innovation. So think about services, think about platform, think about diagnostics, and how that helps us create that end-to-end consumer experience that brings much more care to the healthcare experience than it exists today. And so we started very small and scrappy with a few people in the team. It was very much kind of a combination of three folks from the leadership team, which included the head of tech, the head of R&D, and then myself, and really kind of pulling resources in a team around this opportunity to create a whole new kind of innovation. And so we brought in some people from the outside. We moved some people from internally as well, and we really tried to bring in a very different kind of mindset in terms of how we were running that team, very agile enabled, borrowing from the tech world, and making sure we are going through a sprint process, and making sure that we're testing propositions in a much faster way than we would do on the traditional side of the business. And so it's interesting, because what we're realizing and learning, I guess, through the next team is how do we go faster? How do we actually even test and validate consumer propositions in a very different way? We do a lot of what we call smoke testing, which means putting a bunch of search ads out or social ads, and then we measure kind of conversion rates on the landing pages versus doing a typical kind of concept test or kind of volumetrics test. Okay, that's kind of in real time. And then we're also kind of breaking down some of the internal processes, because there's an expectation around pace and in terms of agility that is different. And so we are kind of experimenting with the cross-functional teams in terms of how we can go much, much, much faster.
Okay. And then, obviously with everything that's happened, there's been a push towards e-commerce, right? People are buying things online that they've never bought before. So can you talk about the shift and the strategies of how you're supporting customers kind of in their journey with e-com?
Yeah, for sure. It's been fascinating to watch the last 12 to 18 months. When you look at it historically, some of our categories were pretty much on the low end of the penetration from an online perspective. When you look at OTC products in the US, pre-COVID, it was roughly 8% of penetration for online, and that number has literally kind of doubled when you look at the numbers, in the middle of COVID. And the numbers actually have gone down very slightly, but at the end of the year, we moved from 16 to 15. So it's still almost double where we were, and it seems to maintain itself at that level. So that's a pretty meaningful and massive kind of shift. And so what we realize is obviously everybody's going after the e-com opportunity. And so when you have triple digit kind of sales lifts, that's great, but in the end, you need to grow consumption. And so going back to that agility piece, we wanted to make sure that we're bringing a lot of those agile principles into how we run e-com. So we're partnered with Accenture actually, in both the European region and the Asia region, to really kind of bring a whole bunch of sprints and experiments to the table to help us really accelerate how we're optimizing what we're doing in almost kind of real time from an e-com perspective. We have, like, for example, right now we have 170 experiments running. I had a meeting this morning with the China team, which was fascinating. We're looking at what Alibaba had created a couple of years ago in the framework that they call AIPL, so awareness, interest, purchase, and then loyalty. And you have lots of granularity in China, obviously, in terms of understanding, the metrics and the data points against all these different phases, and how do you move consumers from one stage to the other, and what are the tactics and the tweaks from a target audience perspective that you can bring to the table to maximize the conversion rate. So this is just an example, but this whole notion in terms of how do you change your ways of working, I find it fascinating, because during COVID, what we realized is the big brands have been winning, right? Because of supply chain availability, because of level of trust. And so how do we make sure we keep that advantage moving forward? And my strong belief is that, really embedding yourself with that sense of agility and pivoting from the ways of working perspective, which is something that Accenture kind of helped us build a stronger muscle on, I think will be super, super critical for us to continue to grow share.
Yeah, I mean, it plays into like how you speak about being consumer obsessed. So you guys pivoted your messaging, pivoted your approach, shifts to e-com, speaking to people differently. So are there any trends or anything that you guys did this year that you think will continue, like that you're excited about? That, we tried this in 2020, we never would have been able to try it in a normal year, and you think that, will help push the business forward in years to come?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that we did is we're trying to redefine exactly what kind of added value we can bring to the consumer. And one of the things that we did in one of our brands in Germany called Voltaren, we just launched the brand in the US as well last year, was to think about, in the context of COVID, how we can create utility for the consumer. And so we launched this destination called Healthy Workout. And the point was, very quickly, since people were stuck at home, couldn't get to the gym, didn't have a trainer, to give them kind of utility. And so literally in a week, we put up the site, we created obviously the destination. We shot 240 videos with either different kind of stretch exercises or kind of workout exercises. We just asked the consumers to go through a very simple, straightforward kind of assessment, and that gave them a personalized kind of routine for them to follow. And so, it was incredibly successful. We got almost more than 1 million kind of videos kind of watched from beginning to end just in a matter of a couple of weeks. Got roughly 300 million impressions around it. So it's kind of a really, really great utility piece of content. Obviously, it's also very rich from a data perspective in terms of what we generated from that perspective and the first-party data that we got from it. For a brand that has the joy of movement at its very core from a positioning perspective, it was such a perfect fit. So this notion about how do we continue to create utility around the brands and services for the consumer. In this particular instances, we're not selling Voltaren, or we were just giving, and we're not putting media against Voltaren per se. We're actually driving people to that healthy workout destination, and that worked really well for us and obviously for the consumer.
Did you personally do it?
So again?
I said, did you personally do the routine that you guys put up?
I did the 240 videos every morning. I do them.
Did you really?
No, of course. I think that it's really cool. A lot of it is around stretching. I feel like when you're in Zoom meetings all day, I feel like you're just more static than ever before. When at least you have to go from one conference room to the other, or you have to commute or whatever. At least you have a little bit of kind of walking exercises. But when you're on Zoom or team meetings all day, it just you're not doing much exercise, right? So even just a few kind of snippets, these are short videos, there's, the bite-sized kind of type pieces of content. And so it's really super easy to go after. And I love the kind of the customization of the tool. I know obviously if you have back pain exercises, it will give you a very different type of content than if you say you have neck pain or knee pain, right? Obviously. So it's a nice way for you to just very quickly kind of curate a set of content assets that work best for you.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of crazy to think about like the behavior with work. I mean, we went from people thinking if you work from home, you're not really working, to like being on like 24/7 Zoom calls when you're like, I used to sometimes be able to actually like go out to lunch when like all day, like our calendars are just like Zoom. So it's like, with like thinking about like people that we work with and teams, it's like now it's like, how do you make it a little bit better? Like we do like try to do like no video call Fridays, because people, it's like very like tiring just to stare at the screen all day. Did you create a home gym? Like, did you fall into the trap of the pandemic? Like, did you buy a Peloton?
Well, I'm a spinning addict. I was one of the early adopters of SoulCycle back then when I was living in New York, when I moved to the UK, I moved to the UK 3 years ago. I was, desperate to try to get a Peloton bike, and so I was one of the first buyers of the Peloton when they first started to ship into the UK. So I've been very, very active, certainly on my Peloton bike. I'm fascinated when I see in some of the classes that I go into, when you have 50,000 people in a given class, and that sense of community that it creates around it, and how this platform has completely and literally kind of exploded. It was there for me, and it was great, and it kept me sane, and it's been a gift sent from heaven, to be honest. I think the other thing that I've been trying to do just to keep my mind in check and is to I have the benefit of not living in London. We live outside of London, and so when I have one-on-ones with my team, I very often do a one-on-one walk, and I encourage you to do the same. So we just do the meeting, and I've actually found myself incredibly focused because I don't have any distraction of looking at my phone or hearing a child kind of running into the room. So that's been something that I try to do at least once a day, even if it's for an hour, just to kind of get me outside and change my mind and have actually really quality conversation.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I think the walking breaks are definitely key. I actually went to the Peloton studio, so I used to like ride in the studio. It was across from my office, so it's interesting to see it from like both sides of the bike. Okay, so how do you think that we start to transition into this new normal? Like as a brand, how are you guys approaching the new normal? Is it just being like agile, like expect for the unexpected, continue to build your pipeline? Like what are things that you guys are doing to prepare to kind of transition us into this new world?
I think from my perspective, it's really continue to accelerate the digitalization of how we go to market, so it's not necessarily for me a change, but it's making sure that we're not going back to the pre-COVID habits. I think we're obviously seeing our media mix obviously has even further kind of pivoted back to a very heavy kind of digital first approach. As we look at the 2021 plans, and granted we're not out of the pandemic, but that percentage continues to increase. The other thing that we're starting to look at as well is, I've been in this for a number of years, and I still remember these super early days when we're trying to convince people to move money from TV to digital. I feel now, in pre-COVID, the discussion was how do you convince people to move stuff from upper funnel to lower funnel, and specifically into e-com media, right? So that was obviously pre-COVID. Now we've been dramatically kind of increasing our e-com media. I think making sure that continues to be a key focus as we move forward, which it is based on the plan that I've seen, remains super critical, because the channel is where the majority of the growth obviously has come from in 2020 and will remain to be so. And I gave you the numbers a bit earlier in regards to the penetration levels.
The only thing I'll say about that, I'm focused on TV, but TV across all screens, and I spent a lot of time doing that. So like I would say like not like upper funnel, lower funnel. I would say just like realizing that you could use channels differently. So you could use TV as a metric, and you could add accountability to TV. So I think it's more about like being clear about what the goal of the campaign is, and then making sure that you're setting it up to learn from it, right? So it's not just like this is on selling more products. It's like how do you dive in and figure out like specifically what lever TV is pulling for you, or not. It's so I would say it's kind of like a balance.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think the parallel to the point that you make is, I think people would always look at social as a loyalty tactic. And, for me, social is an awareness tactic, it's a buy tactic, and it's a loyalty tactic. So I think it's just depending on the jobs to be done and how you decide to activate the channel. So you're totally right.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, you were breaking my heart. So I had to bring it up. A ton of questions especially not now, but a ton of questions are coming in, just because, it seems like in a short time, like you've been, able to like help successfully like change kind of the thinking in an organization and digitize a company. So like what advice, or what's the key advice you would give companies that are going through this, journey of digitization, or companies that maybe weren't as far ahead as GSK, and kind of are playing catch up now?
I mean, the first one, I'm sure will sound pretty basic, but it's actually focusing on the basics. I remember when I first started, I think we just did, super fundamental kind of basic stuff. We did a bunch of search hackathons, for example, across various markets. And the point was just to not do 10 things, but do one thing really, really well. I mean, in the case of healthcare, queries around, all our categories are massive and huge. And historically, we had, gaps in terms of, I think, how we were looking and approaching search as a tactic. And so that was kind of a way for us to just focus on some of the fundamentals first before you get after some of the shiny objects. And when I was at Google, I kind of certainly observed that as well, that, so many clients were getting so super excited about what we're doing, on the shiny object side of the business, when there was so much opportunity to just nail some of the fundamentals, So I think that's one. I think the other piece, which is something that I started to take on for the last 2 years at GSK, is to, of course, think about how marketing looks different, but how is the whole kind of enterprise starting to transform, and that particularly in the context of COVID, I think that became even clearer. We started this 2 years ago where we said, digital transformation is critical for marketing, but digital transformation is critical for the entire enterprise, and we prioritize supply chain and R&D as two other key areas where we needed to do a similar transformation than what we had started, in marketing 4 years ago. And that really helped us, during COVID, because it helped us be smarter from a supply chain perspective as we went through COVID. And it helped us, going back to your innovation question, make sure that, we're much smarter and approach the innovation process differently versus, how we had done it, in the past. So I think just having that holistic view of what digital transformation means is critical, and obviously always starting with some of the fundamentals, and don't do 10 things, do one, but do that really well and in depth.
Yeah, and then I think too, it's like you said, like do one thing, figure out if it works. Like don't start 10 things, don't finish them. Like make sure that you actually like set up the use case, figure out if it works, and then sort of start to scale beyond.
Exactly.
Okay, so I am going to start to pull up some of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. I think we have about 10 more minutes left. First question is, what are your KPIs and how do you measure them? Like, what are key KPIs? Like when you're setting it up, I guess, kind of like organizationally, like with your team, how are you measuring success, that you're, doing a good job and your team is?
Yeah, if the team would smile at this question, because it's one of my favorite topics, one of the things that I borrowed from my Google days is what Google would call OKRs, so objective and key results. And so we started to implement it into the next team, the team that I mentioned to you before, the innovation team. And the point was also to almost kind of give them a meter where we would release funds based on them achieving or not achieving, I guess, their objective and key results. And those would be quarterly, which is a pretty big change for, a typical kind of CPG type companies, when you would usually have, this is your yearly objective, yearly goals, and this is the budget, and then we'll have a budget cycle, and then, we'll talk about it again. This is happening every quarter. And we're trying to, again, not have 50 objectives and key results, but a short list of those. And that drives, I think, the conversations. And I think, I get involved into, I have a pretty good view of where we about to hit the OKRs and where are we not. And then I get involved where we're struggling, so I can roll up my sleeves and get into problem solving with the team versus reviewing everything, So that's kind of the OKR mindset that we're applying. The other thing that we're looking at is, which I like in the OKR framework is like this notion of leading and lagging indicators. So I think very often we're very focused on lagging indicators, but what are the leading indicators as well that you want to make sure you take a look at. And then I guess the last point would be, how do you make sure you have a mix of business objectives, but also capability objectives in OKRs, right? So one of the things that we have as an OKR as a team is, how do we make sure we, as I call it, agilify our own teams? And that's what I would call a capability OKR, right? So that people know what acting in an agile way is. What is a ceremony? What's a retrospective? How do you sprint? What's the backlog of product? And how do you, to make sure that everybody's talking the same language? So having that, so OKRs first. Second, making sure you have the proper mix of leading and lagging indicators. And then the third piece is make sure you have the mix of business OKRs, but also capability OKRs, because I'm sure everybody would agree that capability is always kind of a never-ending kind of quest that you need to make sure you resource properly.
Yeah, I think too, like even like as we in this kind of like a remote world, like the structure that you have set up makes sense, because it also makes people feel included in like an inclusive environment. So you can kind of like encourage like diversity in thought and stuff like that. Because I think that sometimes in a Zoom world and everyone's like constantly busy, it's easy for people to be excluded. But if you're working towards, these goals and everyone kind of understands them, everyone kind of feels included in the larger picture. Okay, Marc. This is funny. So because we talked about Peloton before, someone asked what your favorite instructor is, your Peloton instructor.
I'm really kind of embarrassed because once I find something that gets me excited, I'm sticking to it. And so I love Cody. And I think I'm taking the same class because, like, what if the music isn't as good in that next class? So some of my work colleagues are, we're kind of following each other, and then like, you're not very, you're very much kind of doing the same thing over and over again, which probably from a workout perspective isn't the greatest thing to do, but that's I guess the answer to the question.
Okay, so I'll make one of your New Year's resolutions for you, and that's you're going to try a different instructor.
Okay, sounds good. I'll do that.
All right.
Promise.
Okay. Okay, so this next question, Marc, what have you learned about consumers throughout the pandemic? What did you learn about empowering people that you will take into post-pandemic marketing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did is to make sure that we're all kind of walking the talk around consumer obsession, and just kind of spending the time and carving out the time, I think is super, super critical. And so one of the things that we pushed on as a team, because the Insights Analytics team is part of my organization, was to make sure we're creating a consumer closeness program. So we had actually the top 200 people of the organization spend quite a few hours just one-on-one with consumers, and just to make sure that they have the basic skills to being able to extract value and insights from a conversation with a consumer. Some had never done it, and just get and live and breathe their consumer, right? And it all starts by role modeling at the very top, and it was a fascinating experience, and I obviously did it as well. And I remember listening to consumer, and I think one of the things that he mentioned was that one of his recipe to boost his immunity was was ginger, and where he was taking it was through shots, because as he was actually drinking it, it felt like I was burning and going down to his throat, and the sense of it's actually really, really working, which I thought was a really powerful insight, which I hadn't necessarily thought about, versus a more traditional kind of delivery of taking ginger in a different way, and so it just kind of reminds you that just by looking for the sound bites, you get some really powerful ideas, but it means you need to prioritize, and spending the time with the consumer, which often gets deprioritized, and making sure you're prioritizing it is absolutely critical.
So you talked about changing like your content strategy and speaking to people differently during the pandemic. Did GSK, what was your guys' approach towards advertising? Like, did you stay up the entire time with messaging, and did you change, like, where your commercial messages changed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we believe in the importance of continue to have a conversation with our consumers, and given in the categories that we're in, it made total sense for us to continue to support our businesses. And yes, we made some changes, and I think we also realized that in certain instances, some of the minority groups were hardest hit by COVID, so we actually did some really cool programs, one with the LGBTQ plus community. And so we did a partnership with Gay Times and Pride Sports. And the point was to celebrate some stories from those sport clubs that were really struggling, during the COVID period. And the charities would really help them kind of work through and support them financially, I guess, through this crisis. And we were just telling really powerful stories of some of those clubs and how the brands could potentially support them. So again, that was another example with Voltaren. I talked about the brand before and the joy of movement. And so that was a very different kind of approach to how we might have done things in the past, and so it was about, meeting the boxing team, challenging stereotypes. So, it was about meeting the LGBTQ plus team who's rowing for inclusivity, and having them talk about what COVID meant and how we can help them, and how we can help those sports clubs and all survive, I guess, during that time. And so it was just a sense of empathy with the consumer, I think was critical, and the sense of and making sure we're creating this authentic kind of connection, and instead of doing, you know, good old school kind of push advertising and talking about Voltaire and how great the brand is, you know. So it was a very different kind of take on it, and dialing up that emotional connection that everybody talks about, but at times doesn't do well. So.
All right, well, Dan is back, so I am assuming that we are we out of time, Dan?
Yes, we are wrapping up.
Cool.
Oh, I think we might have frozen Jamie here, but I just want to thank you. Thank you both, Jamie and Marc, for the excellent conversation. And Marc, I'm actually the executive sponsor of Pride at Roku, and I had seen the work you guys had done with Gay Times, and so I think it's just incredible to see you continue to push the needle and try new things and invest in different communities. And so a tip of the hat to all the work that you guys have done, and thank you both for the excellent conversation.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.